Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. This is the 39th episode, and I'm so glad that you're here. It means a lot to me that you all are listening, even on a holiday. Also, happy July 4th. I cannot believe that we are already halfway through 2024. It's crazy. But I hope you're able to enjoy the day off, and whether you're watching some fireworks or grilling out with people, I hope you get to have a good day. I'm actually going to be spending some time with my family, hanging out around the pool and grilling out, so that's like my idea of a perfect day. But if you're also in the mood to discuss a mystery, today we're going to be talking about the Haunted Showboat, which is the 35th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1957. So I was actually able to find two separate covers to discuss today. One is the iconic cover that everyone knows, and this other one, it almost looks like a library edition or possibly an edition from another country. I'm not positive. But if you want to look at these covers before the episode airs on Thursdays, you can check out my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. I always like to post the covers there and actually get your all's input on which ones are your favorites. So in the 1957 edition of this cover, we have Nancy, Bess, and George on the left side, and we can see this dilapidated looking steamboat in the background. And there is a little rowboat with an older gentleman and woman kind of going towards the boat or going away from it. I can't really tell. But there's a full moon, there's all this Spanish moss hanging up in the upper right-hand corner, and it's very spooky looking. I actually really like this cover. It just gets across this mood and this vibe very well, but also Nancy, Bess, and George look pretty much how I expect them to look, how I've always pictured them. You have Bess with the true blonde hair, Nancy has red hair, she's also wearing like this little red tie at her throat, like an ascot or something, and George has the short, darker hair, so they look exactly as I've always imagined them to look. And in the second edition of this cover, we just have Nancy on this cover, and she's in this little canoe, and you can see the steamboat in the background. It's in the middle of the swamp, which is really creepy looking, and you can see a white figure, which I guess is supposed to be the ghost, but I'd never seen this book cover before. I actually found it while I was scouring the internet, and I thought it was kind of interesting looking. So I came up with a funny cover spoof for this book, just kind of what I imagine that the book is about without having read it, or just, a pun or something off of what I'm seeing. And so I came up with, Nancy, you can solve this mystery by yourself. Because we're down here in New Orleans in the swamps and in the bayou, and I just thought it was a funny play on words. Now, as far as rating these covers, I gave the original cover 4 magnifying glasses because it's very neat. It's just cool. It's very mysterious. It makes me excited to read the book. And the library edition, I just gave 2 magnifying glasses. I didn't like that it was just Nancy. I enjoyed the fact that Nancy, Bess, and George were in the first cover. Now, before I read off the characters for this book, I am going to preface this with saying this book was written in 1957, and it's set in the heart of the South, in New Orleans, Louisiana. So, there are a few unfair stereotypes. There are some racial things in this book, so I just want to throw that out there as a disclaimer. So first up on our cast of characters, we have the Colonel, and no, I am not kidding, his name is actually the Colonel, and there is an Aunt Stella. This is Bess and George's aunt, and their daughter, the Colonel and Aunt Stella's daughter, is Donna May. We also have Charles Bartolome, I hope I'm saying his name right, and he is the ex-fiancé of Donna May. Alex Upgrove, who is Donna May's new fiancé. Yes, there is a lot of drama in this book. There is Uncle Rufus, who is a voodoo doctor, and Henry Delaverne and Lavina, who are twins. So now I'm going to go ahead and read a synopsis that I came up with for the Haunted Showboat. The Havers, Bess and George's relatives from New Orleans, invite all the girls down for Mardi Gras and an engagement party for their daughter, Donna May, and her fiancé, Alex Upgrove. According to the cousins, there's been some drama. Donna had been engaged to Charles Bartolome, but broke it off. But Charles has still agreed to help renovate a showboat for Donna's father, the Colonel. Nancy starts packing for the trip, but a man steals her car from her garage with her suitcase in it. Carson buys Nancy a new car, but no sooner have they left River Heights when Nancy suspects and finds a bomb under the hood. Nancy is able to borrow another car from a man at the repair shop, and they head down to New Orleans and hear more about the haunted showboat, the River Princess. Alex Upgrove is acting suspicious, and Nancy's car is seen repainted and black. Nancy meets Uncle Rufus, a man who practices medicinal voodoo, and wonders if he might know more about the showboat hauntings. She also meets a few more interesting characters and hears that pirate treasure may be on board. Nancy and Ned find this treasure and then get knocked out by the thieves, but ultimately the criminals are caught and the showboat is restored to its former glory. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is, "She makes it look easy. Nancy Drew finds long-lost pirate treasure and solves showboat hauntings in Big Easy." Now, I had a suspicion that this book took place in New Orleans when I was looking at it before I even started reading it, so I was so excited when I started to read and figured out that that's where this mystery was going to take place, because New Orleans is one of my favorite places. I've been a few times, and I love the energy down there, and just the French Quarter, the history is so rich down there. It's such a neat place. If you haven't ever been, you should definitely go. So I took several direct quotes and notes for this one, so let's jump right into them. So the first note that I have down is, "We're going to New Orleans again, like in Ghost of Blackwood Hall, but this time we're actually going to be there for Mardi Gras," which I thought was kind of neat. I've never been to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. The times that I've been, it was like in the summer and then in the fall, but it's still, I mean, no matter what time you go, it's just a cool city. So the next thing that I wrote down is just the Colonel, LOL, and I could not stop thinking of Colonel Sanders from KFC. I was just like, I'm just picturing this guy in this white suit and black bow tie, and he's probably carrying a cane, and he's just like, "Well, hello, girls," and just like, I don't know, just stereotypical, like, Southern gentleman, I guess. I don't know, but it was making me laugh the whole time I read this book. So the next note that I have down is, Hannah brings a shawl and a fan of Nancy's mother's from the attic for her to take on her trip, but Togo rips the shawl. He grabs it off Nancy's bed and snags it, and Hannah fixes it, and then Nancy packs it into her suitcase and puts her suitcase in her car in the garage. But then this man comes in and steals her car straight out of the garage, and as if that's not enough, he also bumps into Nancy and knocks her down with the car. I don't know, it just makes me super upset when Nancy, gets stuff of her mother's stolen or lost, or something happens to it, because, Nancy's mom died when she was 3, or sometimes it says 10 in the books, it changes, but it's just so sad, because it's like, that's all the memories that Nancy has of her mom, and then this guy just stole the car, with her suitcase in it. So the police put out an alert on Nancy's stolen blue convertible, but in the meantime, Carson goes and buys Nancy a new one, and it's a yellow convertible, and George and Bess ooh and ah over it. And George notes that, Nancy's old car had an ink stain in the back seat and a snag in the carpet, and Nancy says, "Well, I guess the thief actually did me a favor." But a few days later, Carson tells Nancy to go down to the police station and check out the police lineup, and he calls the suspect gallery the Rogues Gallery. I just thought that was funny. I can just picture Carson calling a criminal, "You rogue, how about you scallywag?" So this next note has to do with Nancy, Bess, and George's clothing, and Nancy goes to pick up Bess and George to go to New Orleans, and it says they're wearing smart wool dresses and warm car coats, and I was like, I have a car coat. It's in the very back of my car, and some snow boots. I luckily don't have to use them very often around here, but yeah. So Nancy, Bess, and George hardly even get out of town. They've just left River Heights, and Nancy starts hearing this ticking sound that sounds like an alarm clock, and she begins to suspect that there's a bomb somewhere in this new car. So they pull over, and she looks under the hood of the car, and sure enough, there's a bomb, and Nancy asks a passing motorist to get the police to send out the bomb squad. So Nancy, Bess, and George stand way across the road, and they watch the bomb squad put this bomb in a bucket of oil to, I don't know, neutralize it or something. I've never heard of anybody doing this, but thankfully I've never had a bomb under the hood of my car. Knock on wood. But yeah, I think the last time we saw a bomb, I don't remember what book it was in, but Carson actually had one in his car, and Nancy she threw it across the yard or something. I can't remember, but it was crazy. But yeah, this is the second time we've seen a bomb in this series. Or actually, you know what? I'm pretty sure it was Carson. He disarmed the bomb and he said, "Oh yeah, I took a disarming bomb class." I was like, that was not what I was expecting. So the next note that I took down, Bess sees a man driving Nancy's old car and she notices it and it's been painted black. So they chase him and lose him. But then Nancy's car makes another noise, the yellow convertible, and it turns out that acid was poured on the housing of the car. So this repairman lets Nancy borrow his car, but I was like, how many car mishaps can we have? We've moved from boats to cars, I've noticed. I guess that's like the new thing for the 1950s. So the book actually says that Bess is a good driver, which I thought was just an interesting little tidbit of information. But Nancy, Bess, and George take turns driving to New Orleans because that's quite a ways from River Heights. And I think River Heights is supposed to be like in Iowa or Illinois somewhere. And at one point, Bess stops to consult the map, and this man like pops up next to the car window and scares her to death. And he says a man had come through before them asking if he'd seen 3 girls. So it's the car thief. And I was like, okay, that's just creepy. Now, this next note, I just started with yikes, yikes, yikes. So, those racial stereotypes that I was talking about, here they are. So, the Havers, which are Bess and George's relatives, apparently have a maid and a butler described as, quote, an elderly colored couple. And they're named Mammy Matilda and Pappy Cole. And I said, look, I know times were different, and this book was written in the 1950s, but it doesn't make it any easier to read. I mean, I'm from the South, and it makes me really uncomfortable to read this kind of stuff, but at least the one silver lining in all of this is they didn't make them talk. You know what I mean? Like how in some older books, they make people talk in a really disjointed and kind of offensive way, so at least they didn't do that. So Alex Upgrove, who is Donna Mae's new fiance because she got rid of last year's edition, Charles Bartolome, makes a move on Nancy, and I was like, okay, this guy is just a sleazeball, but he whispers, "You and I are going to have a wonderful time together solving the plantation mystery." I was like, ugh, just yuck. Like, dude, you're about to get married. Now, my next note has to do with some of the descriptions in the book of the scenery, and I said, okay, I love the South and New Orleans, but this description got me. It says, Nancy went into the garden to gaze at the bayou, which lay beyond the extensive flower beds. Large water oaks, dripping with long festoons of Spanish moss, rose above the mist which covered the swamp. Like, that sounds beautiful to me. I've actually been to some of the swamps down in New Orleans, and it was such a neat experience. I went on one of those airboat tours, and you get to see gators and go back in some of the bayous and lagoons, and it was just so cool. But this description, like, took me right back, and that's what I like about some of these books. Like, if I haven't been to the places in the books, it makes me want to go there, or if I have been to these places, it just brings me right back. So Donna Mae, who is the Colonel's daughter and Bess and George's cousin, she's kind of spoiled from some of the descriptions we get in the book, but she insists that the girls dress as fairies for this play that they're going to put on the Showboat once it's all restored. And George says, "I hardly think I rate wings anyway." And I was like, I have to agree, George, you are no angel. I will say, though, the last few books that we've read, George has been so much nicer to Bess, which I appreciate. So this next thing that I wrote down, I said, whoa, they actually reference Madame LaLaurie, I hope I'm saying her name right, and her haunted home where she killed around 100 slaves. This woman was a horrible person in New Orleans history. If you've been to New Orleans, or even if you haven't, you've probably heard of this woman. I think they did a episode or a season on American Horror Story based on her. She's just was a disgusting person. But they also talk about Jean and Pierre Lafitte, notorious pirates, and Bess makes this comment that she's glad that the Lafitte's made up for their miserable deeds because they owned some slaves or sold some, which is not cool, by fighting in the 1812 Battle of New Orleans. And I said, I don't know if that really redeems them of their past actions, really. But you know what? That's one of the things about history is, there's good people and there's bad people, and there's good things that happen and there's bad things that happen. And, I try to take everything with a grain of salt and try to learn things from the past. So Donna Mae's mother says that the fairy costumes that Nancy, Bess, and George were going to wear are inappropriate. And George says, want to see how a winged fairy acts? And then it says she bends double and began to do a dance step that resembled an Indian ceremonial. And I was just like, okay, we could have probably done without this. But while they're doing this rehearsal for the play, Bess falls and strains her arm, and Donna Mae actually has the nerve to get mad at her. She gets mad at her cousin for falling and hurting herself, and she just is like, you're gonna ruin everything, and just runs upstairs. And I was like, what a brat. She kind of, like, I'm just picturing this character kind of like Charlotte LaBeouf from The Princess and the Frog. Just, she's blonde, and she's very spoiled. I can just picture her being like, oh, Bess, you ruined everything. Now I'm going to have to get the Colonel to get someone else to be in the play, you no good rotten cousin of mine. Like, I'm sorry, I could not tolerate being around someone like that. So my next note is Alex keeps hitting on Nancy and being nosy. He, at several points in this mystery, tries to sidetrack Nancy. Like, he and Donna Mae take them out on this boat tour, and they pretty much leave them stranded, and they know that Charles, Bartolome had invited them to dinner, and he's just purposely keeping Nancy away from this guy so she can't figure out more aspects to the mystery. But I was like, Alex is on my last nerve too. Now, my next note is Uncle Rufus takes Nancy, Bess, and George in a canoe through the swamp, and it hits this man-made net thing that someone has strung up to basically keep them from going any closer to the showboat. And I said, nope, I could not. That swamp is full of gators. That is terrifying. So that swamp airboat tour that I took in New Orleans, it was fun, but I did have in the back of my mind, if anything goes wrong and this thing sinks or flips over, God forbid, there are gators everywhere. I got to where I was really good at spotting them. They would just come up and you'd see their eyes, and I was like, there's a swarm of these around the boat right now. No need to panic, but if this boat goes down, it's not going to be good. So a little later in the book, Nancy comes upon Uncle Rufus doing this voodoo in his yard, and they're speculating that the people that are on the showboat and haunting it, because there's been weird noises coming from it, they think that possibly it's a local group that lives in New Orleans that practices voodoo. And I was like, I know there's voodoo and hoodoo, and I don't really know the difference. I think one is more medicinal and the other one is just more of a practice. I don't really know, but it really reminded me of playing the game The Legend of the Crystal Skull, because we talked quite a bit about that with Renee's character in that game. But Nancy starts by suspecting Uncle Rufus, but then she learns that he's actually a really nice man and he is no longer on her suspect list. But when he turns around to talk to her, he talks about how spiders are representative of the devil. And I was like, I can totally relate to that. I am super arachnophobic. I cannot do spiders. But another interesting thing, while I was on that airboat tour, the only thing that was more terrifying to me than the thought of all the alligators in the water was the spiders. So our tour guide actually was, taking us through this bayou, and he said, I'm going to look for one of these spiders. And I cannot remember what they were called, but he said, yeah, they come down to the water and they put their legs on the top of the water and lure fish, and then they bite the fish, which poisons the fish, and then they carry it back into the trees. I started dying laughing. It was kind of like this nervous laughter, and then nobody else on the boat was laughing. And I was like, wait, you're serious? There's a spider that can incapacitate a fish? Okay, I'm out. But Nancy, she does the dumbest thing. So she's pulling a flower off of a lily pad off the surface of the water in the swamp, and there's a gator that almost snaps her hand off. And I'm just like, no, Nancy, use your brain. Don't do that. The next note that I wrote down is Donna Mae says that the city was engineered to stop flooding. And I said that didn't age well because Katrina says otherwise. The levee systems down in New Orleans, that was one of the biggest disasters. And when I went back in, it was 2014, they were still recovering in a lot of areas from Katrina. So that little note was just interesting to me. So Alex Upgrove, Donna Mae's horrible fiance, throws this piece of paper with a drawing on it out the car window, and Nancy is like, that's a little weird and suspicious, so she stops to get it, and I think it's described as like a burgundy drawing with like a gold cross on it or something, and she just kind of files that away. But while she's picking that note up, she sees her car parked in back of this house, and she calls the police, and then the thief gets away right out from under her nose. They go out a back way. Now, there's also this ghostly figure that's seen on the showboat, and there are drums that are heard, and Nancy and Charles Bartolome see Henry de la Verne and his sister Luvina. They're the twins that were mentioned in the list of characters. They were rowing out to the boat, and it's kind of sweet, but Luvina's husband died, and her memory has lapsed, and her brother just takes her out to the showboat to live out her dreams of being an actress. And I was like, that is so sweet and also sad. The next note that I have down is George falls down some stairs on the showboat. So finally, Nancy, Bess, George, Bert, Dave, and Ned get to explore this showboat, but George almost gets really badly hurt, but she turns out to be okay. It's also at this point in the book when Nancy gets her car back, and she finally gets her suitcase with her mother's fan and shawl in it back. So I was glad that she got those items back because they were important to her. So the next note that I have down, George thinks that Alex Upgrove is lying about his identity and who he is, and he keeps saying that he went to Oxford, and I said he's a lot like Gatsby, because Gatsby kind of lies about going to Oxford. But Nancy goes to ask Henry Laverne about him because she knows that he attended Oxford, and they find out that Alex altered the picture he gave George. So they're talking to him, and when Nancy happens to look up, she catches Alex spying on them through the window. So Alex goes missing for a few days because he knows that people are suspicious of him, and Donna Mae is like all upset, but nobody else is. And there is a pirate treasure that everyone finds on the boat, and that is why someone was wanting everyone to stay away from the boat. They were trying to convince people that it was haunted so they could find the treasure themselves. So like in most Nancy Drew books or games, Nancy and Ned have just pulled the treasure out of this hiding place in the boat, and they get knocked out by Alex Upgrove and then some guy named Spike. And I said Spike is just some random guy we're only just hearing about, and he gets caught, and later Alex is caught dressed like a pirate on a Mardi Gras float with the treasure. But the drawing that he threw out of his car earlier in the book, Nancy figures out that is a design that's on the float. So in the end, Alex is caught, and Charles Bartolome actually forgives Donna Mae, and I said, I don't know if she really deserves it, but they continue on with their engagement. So for the next section of this podcast, I have a What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen segment. Hannah wasn't actually in this book, but we did get some descriptions of some good home-style Southern cooking. Nancy, Bess, and George order this fried chicken platter with like cornbread and sweet potatoes when they stop for a night at a motel. And they also get pecan pie, which is my favorite. And then they also go to this place called Antoine's, which is actually a real place in New Orleans. It's like a 4 or 5 star restaurant, and it's the birthplace of Oysters Rockefeller. I'm not much of an oysters fan myself, but they also have chicken in the bag, whatever that is. And then at another few points in the book, they have corn cakes and ham, stuffed pheasant, orange juice, bacon, eggs, toast, and cocoa. So for the add that to your resume section of the podcast, I like to come up with things that I think that Nancy could add to her resume. And I said bomb sniffer. She just knows that there's a bomb in her car. And swamp tracker. She goes through the swamp. She falls into the swamp. She just lives in the swamp. Now, for the things that I liked about the Haunted Showboat, I really liked the descriptions of scenery in the South, the swamp and the French Quarter. I really enjoyed reading that kind of stuff, and I love the great finale. I love that they caught Alex at Mardi Gras. That was so cool. For the things that I didn't like some of the racial stereotypes that were prevalent in this book, and Donna Mae. She was just really a spoiled brat. So I gave The Haunted Showboat a rating of 3 magnifying glasses. It was a pretty good book. There were a few problems that I had with it, but for the most part, it was a great mystery. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for the Haunted Showboat. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like the podcast, if you could leave me a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I would really appreciate it. And for next week's episode, this will be episode number 40, and we're going to be doing a Her Interactive game. We're going to be talking about Stay Tuned for Danger, one of the first games that came out in the late 90s. So if you like bomb threats against soap opera stars, then you will definitely love this episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.